John Carroll University shines.
So welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Bernard Prusak, and I hold the Raymond and Eleanor Smiley Chair in Business Ethics here at John Carroll. This is our second annual Ethics at John Carroll lecture, showcasing the work of one of our faculty here. This year's speaker is Dr. Mindy Peden, Professor of Political Science and Interim Director of our Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program. Dr. Peden has been at John Carroll since 2003 after completing her PhD in government at Cornell University. She specializes in political theory, as will be evident from her talk this evening. Dr. Peden also has expertise in comparative politics, and she connects her scholarship to her travel experiences, starting with her time as an undergraduate exchange student at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. Please join me in thanking her for sharing her work with us.
Thanks. I want to specify, first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I see, can you hear this okay? Mm-hmm. I hear students, I see faculty, I see friends, I see family, I see colleagues, so thank you for being here. I'm not an ethicist. This is a lecture on ethics, but I am not an ethicist. As Dr. Prusak said, I study and I teach about politics, and I was trained in the subdisciplines that he mentioned. As you'll see from this talk tonight, I used what I would call mixed methodologies in my understanding: historical, discursive, critical, structural, sociological, comparative, inductive, deductive, and so on. All right, so why taxation? Again, the title of this talk is Taxation and Legitimacy, Government, Economy, and Justice. I kind of subtitled this part of my talk, From Rates to Relationships. So like generations before me, I work and live in relation to other people, living and dead, and their creative endeavors. Humans are known to develop tools, otherwise known as technologies. Assumedly, these technologies make life better than it would otherwise be. My approach today, taxation as a political technology. So what is taxation? In some sense, it's the process by which the government collects money from individuals, from households, from organizations. It involves mandatory payments backed by the force of law with penalties. In theory, taxes fund our common life, roads that people drive on, bridges we cross, wars fought in our name to protect us from threats. Refers to goods and services. And we trust, oftentimes, that it is built in the public interest. That trust is the ground of what we call legitimacy. In that sense, we might assume that the purpose of taxation is to generate revenue, to organize collective resources. But it also influences behavior, the behavior of individuals and organizations. One very popular way of thinking about this is what we call sin taxes. They're very popular. I mean, how many of you love taxes? Right. Yeah. Sin taxes are taxes on like alcohol or cigarettes. They're very popular because they are backed by a kind of morality, that those are things that people don't think other people should be doing. So they also maintain a kind of order. As Habermas has argued, modern states live and die by their economic performance, their coercive force, and most significantly by their legitimacy, the belief that their authority is justified and their promises credible. So one question I want to start with today is this question: how does taxation mediate the relationship between government, economy, and justice? In other words, what can taxation tell us about how states organize power, justify authority, and sustain or lose legitimacy? So to do that, I want to first talk about power, structure, and legitimacy. To To think about legitimacy, we have to begin with power, which is related to the term authority. Robert Dahl famously defined power as a relationship in which A has power over B to the extent that A can get B to do something B would not otherwise do. This definition emphasizes agency, power as individual in relationship to other individuals. It's observable, and it can be studied scientifically. That was one of the, sort of big things that this conception brought to the study of politics. But what are known as structural theorists have pushed back from this understanding. They argued that power also, or more importantly, operates through institutions, through norms, through arrangements that shape what is possible long before anyone acts. So power is not only exercised between individuals, it is embedded in structures that determine or partly determine. From the structural perspective, government is not merely a set of decisions. It is a system that organizes legitimacy. It tells a story about who belongs, who decides, and who pays. It's a story of values. This next slide, I asked ChatGPT to make. Based on my ideas, I don't know. Today, business metaphors dominate our political imagination. So is government just like a business? Citizens are cast as consumers or as workers, governments as firms, or like what Adam Smith said, as states, although he was critical of that view, and political decision-making as management, top-down, hierarchical. Efficiency over fairness, profit over participation. This is not a neutral shift. It reflects what Habermas called the colonization of the life world by economic rationality. In what we call liberal capitalist democracies, legitimacy depends, Habermas told us, on two contradictory imperatives. The first one is that the state must enable markets to function and wealth to accumulate. The second is that it must protect citizens from the inequalities and insecurities that same economic system, capitalism, creates. Taxation sits at that fault line. When citizens perceive that the wealthy and corporations do not pay their share, or that public funds serve private privilege, legitimacy falters. That's what Habermas called a legitimation crisis. When the story the state tells about fairness and opportunity no longer rings true. In these moments, governments often retreat into the language of efficiency and growth, treating economic logics as quasi-religious truths. And when economic logics are more significant than democratic dialogue, Habermas describes this as administrative rationality, rule by expertise rather than public reasoning. I kind of forget what I have as my slides. So, the stories are told by experts, and organized interests, or factions, we might call them. Those were just sort of to describe what I was describing as a legitimation process, crisis. So the stories are told by experts, and organized interests, or what I call factions, from Federalist 10. Historically, that is known as interest groups, but I'm particularly interested in how business interests become factions. So these stories are that taxation must obey market laws, that fairness must yield to efficiency, that high taxes will drive away investment. These are presented as natural truths, but they are, in fact, political choices made invisible through what I call quantification. So my own work argues that this quantification of politics, what I've often called the quantifiable action, narrows the ethical vocabulary of democracy. Taxation becomes a matter of calculation, not collective organization or will. Citizens are modeled as homo economicus, not as co-authors of the political community. As governance becomes increasingly calculative, legitimacy shifts from the terrain of consent or choice to that of expertise and calculation. And in this terrain, the most powerful structures are the economic ones, because the more money you have, the more expertise you can buy to support your goals. Think about publicly traded corporations. There is a legal imperative to increase profits for shareholders. That structural constraint conditions how people make decisions within that environment. Sociologists famously study this. In other words, in these models, legitimacy is not about democratic participation, but about technocratic performance, conditioned by the assumption that this is simply how the economy works. The danger is that what could be an ethical and political question, how do we organize our society so that it reflects and cultivates democratic, in other words, rule by the people, for the people, values, democratic values as values that are, somehow our own, right? It becomes a technical one. How can we optimize returns on investment? And that is not just a semantic shift. It's a structural transformation of the possibilities for democratic life. So I started thinking about this when I was in graduate school. I had the basic question, like, what is a democratic approach to taxation? And there wasn't a clear answer. And in fact, political theory, which is my field, had very little to say about it, remarkably little. In the Rawlsian and post-Rawlsian literature, taxes appear as background institutions, instruments for implementing distributive principles that are assumed but not interrogated. This neglect is not accidental. It reflects what Iris Marion Young called the distributive paradigm, a model of justice that imagines individuals as possessors and consumers of goods. Justice becomes a question of who gets what. This paradigm hides the question of how wealth, obligation, and dependence are created in the first place. It erases production, and it depoliticizes relationships. It casts citizens as consumers or workers, what are known as economic subjects, the state as a service provider, and taxation as a fee for a service, a payment for the goods of government. Iris Young has tried to correct this. For her, justice is about enabling participation, ensuring people can act as political agents. Another important thinker in this regard is Elizabeth Anderson, who extends this idea, her idea of democratic equality, which means relations in which no one is subordinated or humiliated. Nancy Fraser, another important thinker, adds the insight that these justice debates, they're called the justice debates in our field, ignore the deeper structures of production and decision-making that underlie. Taken together, these thinkers show that taxation is not just fiscal, it's relational. Taxation expresses how citizens recognize one another as members of a shared political community. To pay taxes and to deliberate about what they should fund is to participate in defining the collective good. But that is not how taxes work. Instead, the collective good is steered by a particular kind of economic rationality, what Max Weber has termed instrumental rationality. There's a long history in political theory of thinking about leadership kind of like a boat captain, like that you're steering a kind of a ship. And so what I'm trying to do here is explain how the ship is steered by sort of ideas and calculations and that sort of thing, instead of being steered by us, by people. So these are examples of two really important principles in taxes that I researched that came, if you look at the public finance literature, the history traces back to these two principles, which I have an article about, I'll show you at the end, both of which fall short. Principled thinking, in my mind, isn't necessarily the way to go when we think about these things. So rather, this is a map of South Africa. Taxation is a technology of power. And I learned that I understand it that way because I I have an interest, a longstanding interest in Africa, and the literature on state building in Africa often has started with the question of like, why, there's all these failed states in Africa. Why don't people want to pay taxes? And when I learned about how taxes were implemented in states under colonialism and after, I realized that it was pretty logical not to want to pay them. And I'm going to try to explain why that is. So traditional liberal principles of taxation, like ability to pay or benefit, which I just mentioned, overlook the way taxation actually constructs citizens as wage earners rather than merely about extracting value. It overlooks what we call the constitutive aspect of taxation as a technology of power. In other words, it makes us do things that we might otherwise not do. So it's called constituent power or constitutive power. Taxation is inseparable from the monetary economy and from the historical tension between coerced or enslaved labor and freedom. So I'm going to try to explain that. Late 19th century South Africa offers a telling case. Colonial tax policies were not simply revenue generating. They were designed to create a wage labor force among African populations. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and the discovery of gold intensified what was thought of as a need for mine labor, prompting poll and head taxes to coerce Africans into wage work. If you're head taxes and also hut taxes. Here's an example of hut tax. Historically, one way to sort of introduce what might be called a progressive tax scheme early on was to tax windows, like in Great Britain, because windows were a sign that if you were rich enough to have windows, then you'd be rich enough to pay taxes. In the South African example, people were taxed based on huts because taxing individual male Africans didn't seem to capture wealth, and in fact, many men had multiple homes, huts, and so they were taxed based on each individual hut. But in this context, what I've learned is that taxes were framed as educational tools, teaching Africans, quote unquote, responsibility and integrating them into a cash economy. The European settlers who came to the Horn of Africa, to the bottom of Africa and everywhere in Africa, faced income and property taxes, while the Africans paid flat taxes, emphasizing coercion over revenue. Now this is some of you have seen this. This is, it doesn't say where it came from because it got cut off, but this is from a book which is very helpful to me, called Citizen and Subject by Mahmoud Mamdani. And so I generated this image from my notes about this book, and I thought it was pretty good. Basically, one of the things that it emphasizes is that in the colonial situations, there were, people were treated differently. Some people were treated as citizens, other people as subject to the law, but not necessarily having, a role in creating it. And so that's why he describes the colonial state as an authoritarian order. So racialized ideologies and what we might call labor needs shaped these fiscal policies more than revenue logic. I learned this from close readings of this text, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa by Sir Frederick Lugard. He rationalized the system of coercive labor as educative, as part of the liberal democratic project. He argues that the taxes were teaching Africans responsibility and about liberty and justice. But his framework masked the coercion behind that education, turning taxation into a mechanism for socializing Africans into wage labor and producing compliant subjects under the guise of civilization. Some people have argued that when the slave trade was ended, that capitalism was no longer, or what we think of as capitalism, was no longer able to extract and accumulate wealth at the same rate. And so it was in that context that these ideas were developed. So taxation is symbolic and material. It's a technology of political, economic, and moral engineering. It reveals how fiscal systems produce paradoxical subjects, coerce laborers imagined as democratic actors, for example. The British colonial officials, like Lord Lugard here, represented a state that recognized that buying and selling of human beings was anathema to democracy and to legitimacy, but yet was also interested in encouraging economic prosperity understood as accumulation of wealth. This coalesces around a notion of civilization. This colonial history illuminates a broader truth. Taxation is never merely economic. It creates an environment of constraints on behavior, grounded in expressions of authority. It is how legitimacy is enacted or denied. This is a sort of understanding of what we mean when we talk about capitalism. So if taxation is where legitimacy is negotiated, accounting, or the practice of accounting, is where legitimacy is measured and manufactured. It is a powerful technology of power. Accounting turns human relations into numbers, costs, profits, debts, making value look objective even when it rests on domination and control. It is, in a sense, the hidden grammar of legitimacy. The example of Islamic accounting incorporates a different mode of thinking about the economy. It's structured differently from what most in this room think of as accounting, because it's grounded in a moral imperative against the borrowing and lending of money. My point in bringing that up is that there are different modes of accounting. It is the way that we tend to think about it is not a necessary or objective structure. They're actually quite varied, and other modes of counting are possible. So it's this possibility, this future orientation that I want to turn to now. So I use the word revolutionary in one of my papers that is published. I'll show you here in a minute. And I use it very deliberately because I think of what I want to do as revolutionary, not in the sense, or what I want to, how I see change possible as something akin to revolutionary, which is often counterpoised to what's known as reform. So my question is, how can we change the mode of production of value, or the structure, to reflect democratic values? That's what I mean by revolutionary. To reflect democratic values, the values of self-rule or rule by the people. The concept of revolutionary accounting, as I use it, asks questions like the following. What if our ledgers somehow included care or ecology and solidarity, qualitatively rich values that require a deeper expression than can be represented numerically? What if we audited creditors and states instead of mostly debtors and individuals? This is not only a fiscal question, it's a moral and political one. Revolutionary accounting seeks to change the structure of the economy and therefore of business ethics. The revolutionary approach that I am using in this part of the talk privileges other goals besides profit. And as I've pointed out, it is a part of the legal environment of business in this country, if you are a publicly traded company, corporation especially, that you have to chase profit. From my perspective, profit is not an ethical value. Revolutionary accounting could seek to recognize the full human and ecological costs of economic life and account for what markets leave invisible. Things like care work, community, repair, attention, time. In this version, business becomes not a sphere apart from democracy, but one of its most consequential arenas. The question would no longer be, how do we maximize shareholder value, But how do we organize value creation so that it sustains our shared world? That shift is not anti-business. It's about restoring legitimacy to business by reconnecting to its democratic values. This is an example of, sort of how one might think about accounting principles. I don't have a very good sense of where the slides go in my talk, sorry. So this is also, I talked about profit, and so I wanted to show this definition of profit, what it means. What is a profit, right? It's the amount of revenue minus, sorry about that typo, expenses that results in a positive value. A profitable company has more revenue than expenses. They make a profit. So participatory budgeting is something that is going on around the world, something that is studied by people who have concerns like mine. Also, citizen debt audits and cooperatives, they're experiments in this direction. Small attempts to make the fiscal sphere a site of public reasoning and collective agency. They remind us that every spreadsheet tells a story about what and who counts. So for my conclusion, I'm going to talk about legitimacy as collective ownership over the future. Every state and all authority rests on a story that makes its power believable. Oh, yes, I forgot to talk about odious debt, but there it is. These are some key terms that current discourse uses in talking about, mainstream discourse uses in talking about taxation. I'm going to try to move beyond this. For centuries, ours has been a story that economic growth and freedom would serve all, despite the observable effects that chasing accumulation has on the lived experience of most people. When that story collapses, legitimacy collapses with it. But crises are creative. Crises can be creative, a legitimation crisis. They remind us that the economy is not a force of nature. It is a human creation. Humans made it, humans can govern it. In the end, taxation, debt, and accounting are not neutral instruments. They are moral vocabularies of power. They tell us what we owe one another and who gets to decide. They help shape our subjective experiences. If scientized approaches to government and business represent the capture of fiscal politics by administrative rationality, then revolutionary accounting represents the return of fiscal politics to democratic imagination. The crisis of legitimacy in taxation and in business is not about compliance or efficiency. It is about the erosion of shared meaning in economic life. Restoring legitimacy, if there ever was any, means claiming fiscal practices as communicative acts, where numbers serve democracy rather than replace it. In this sense, legitimate power is not might makes right, or whoever is richest decides everything. It is the capacity to act together to create and sustain the institutions that make collective life possible. In that sense, the way I see the ethical task before us is to make businesses, especially publicly traded corporations, accountable, not only to balance sheets, but to the democratic values that give those balances meaning. This is a bibliography of my published work on these issues. Thank you. And
Okay, so there was a lot there, right? So this is Q&A time, and for students, faculty already know this, but for students that means like this is your chance to ask your questions and to do some thinking. So ask for clarification. If you think you understand and you disagree, say as much and see what Dr. Peden has to say in response. So normally, when I host a talk, and I'm kind of sort of hosting this one, I like to begin with students, because once you get faculty going, they just won't stop sometimes. So let's start with students, and we can be patient too. I'm sure you have questions. You're all intelligent people, so thoughts crossed your mind. I've got a bunch of questions myself, but I'm not going to ask mine yet. So what do we have? Dr. Peden will repeat the question more or less. I'm not going to bring the mic around, but do project, okay?
All right, she'll do her own Q&A, but
Yeah, here's somebody to begin with.
Hi, thanks.
First of all, thank you. Really awesome talk. I think that one idea that you talked about revolutionary accounting and making sure that it takes a more holistic approach of everything was really insightful. What I'm wondering though is, are there any instances you think now where we're seeing implementation in tax code or legislation that kind of has that sort of revolutionary accounting? And if not, what are steps we can take, or maybe quantitative measures we can do to kind of bridge the gap between numbers and morality?
Thank you for asking that question. So the way I understood your question was, what are examples of revolutionary accounting, or are there examples? And I'm going to start with that for a second and then come back to the second part. People have been accounting for their lives, accounting for their economic lives since before we had writing, would be my guess. But if you look at the history of accounting, it sort of started as, in a written form, keeping track of not just stuff, but economic or just life in general. I mean, and so historically, yes, people have accounted for, or, articulated accountability for processes, organizations, as far as I know, as long as we've been human, I think. In reality, that term revolutionary accounting came from engaging with the literature on the history of accounting, and something in the accounting literature that's known as emancipatory accounting, that emerged as practices to try to record different ledgers, so to speak, of accountability than what were being imposed by colonialism. So you find in colonial, it's an attempt, a historical attempt by historians to try to resurrect and explain how everyday people kept track of the sort of comings and goings of economic life. And in that sense, it is, it's an idea that emerged from that literature. As far as examples, I think the idea of participatory budgeting, which is much more popular in Europe than it is here in the United States. You don't really hear about it here. It's studied, there's a lot of examples in Spain, for example, where the idea is, and in Iceland too, actually, I was there when they were doing some participatory budgeting. The idea of taking a chunk of money and trying to find out, like, how do people want to spend that on a small scale, like, in a city or something like that. They did it in Reykjavik, I remember, and also in many, like I said, in many cities in Spain. And it's a process. It's a process where people start to have a conversation about what they want that money to go towards. In our system, in the United States, it's assumed that our representatives have those conversations. But my argument here and elsewhere is that the very conditions of those, of their ability to represent are constrained by certain approaches. So, I don't know. Does that clarify a little bit, or?
Yeah.
What was the other part of your question?
It was, what are some ways that, in American society or legislature, can we now bridge that gap between, like, morality and accounting and the numbers?
Well, we could write the actual tax code. Tax code is written by experts. In the democratic system, most of our elected officials do not understand the tax code. As far as I understand it, they are written by people who are experts, accounting or economic experts, and it's grounded in a strong commitment in our country to the Lockean principle that government is, the Lockean sort of idea that was imported into our in our way of doing things, that the goal of our country is the pursuit of property. That was the original framing. It wasn't the pursuit of happiness, it was the pursuit of property in John Locke's. And the way that we think about property in this country and how it's implemented into law is a constraint. Only some people, it's one, there's other ways that there are people who experiment with different ways of conceptualizing property, like Roberto Unger at Harvard Law School, who tried out his ideas in Brazil. I don't know how well they went, how well they worked, but he has this idea of a kind of a looser, I guess you could say, conception of what private property is. So we face those constraints, but right now, that's the sort of the way I look at it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Steph.
So at the end of the talk, you mentioned how you suggest that we should make businesses accountable to the democratic values to give those balances meaning. But how would you go about incentivizing or convincing some of the shareholders or the business owners to adopt practices like participatory budgeting and other processes that might better reflect the democratic values in our system?
That's a great question. How would you go about changing the incentives for businesses to do these things? There's only really one way. That's law and coercion. And that would come from changing the environment. What is how things are governed. It comes from changing the incentive structure, of course, and simply not allowing it. Simply, coming at the question with what I would call probably a liberal democratic approach, which is that, listen, you have control over a lot of value. You make decisions about that affect a lot of people. And that is upheld, that your ability to operate as a business is upheld by our legal system. Our legal system protects your property. And so if the legal system changes, the incentives change. And I'm not talking about just like regulations or something like that. I'm talking about a change in how we think about it. If you are a corporation that earns, $3 billion in profit, you need to prove to the people why you deserve to keep that. We don't ask for accountability in that way, I think. Sorry if I sound kind of harsh, but I'm trying to really answer it directly. You're welcome. Because the decisions that they make affect a lot of people. Yes? Hi.
To bounce off of that, what would it look like if everything was to be implemented for those companies to be, at that point, non-profit? How would that look for economic growth for the U.S.?
Okay, so the question is, what would it look like for economic growth if companies were nonprofit, right? Well, I'm not really arguing that everybody should operate without a profit, but I do think if you extract a profit, there should be a legible reason why you are allowed to keep that, instead of the assumption that it's yours to begin with. Look, we're about to enter into, we've been in a government shutdown. As of 2 days from now, people who don't, who are dependent on things like food stamps are going to cease to have that ability to buy food. This is important to me because I grew up in a situation of dependency on such models. It supported my development as a person. I think that 40% of people who are on SNAP benefits are children, elderly mostly, and then of the people who aren't, 70% work. They already work, they don't make enough to be able to sustain themselves. So from a social perspective, this is an unsustainable system. I guess to kind of go back to what Steph was asking, like, I'm not interested in appealing to business interests, to ask them to change. I'm talking about power. I'm talking about achieving real power and setting up a situation that actually does benefit all, instead of a sort of what I would probably refer to as a sort of fictional idea that somehow this system benefits all of us, when that looks materially untrue to me. Does that make sense? Yes, Jeff.
This is a bit of a long question, but I think it's relevant and important, so I want to hear what you have to say. So you explained earlier in the presentation that taxes are in part legitimate and that it's based on the consent of the governed to be put to use for the benefit of the public, though there's a growing movement today of people that believe that their tax money is not being put to good use. So historically, tax resistance has been this form of civil disobedience to protest the use of tax money for issues that don't benefit us. Do you believe that the constituency has the right to engage in this? And or, on top of that, do you believe that it's even viable in our country with income tax, sales tax, and property tax?
Okay, so I think your question is about tax resistance, right? Which is a big, there's a lot of it in history. There's been a lot of tax resistance. There's been a lot of people, if you've ever heard of like the War Tax Resisters League in the United States, they didn't want to have their tax money go to war. So what happens to them? Well, they are penalized. They're penalized through the law. I mean, that's how it works, right? But we're not, we don't have a mechanism it's not like, how do we figure out what benefits we receive from the state, right? Like or what our tax money goes towards. It looks like you pay it, and then it's this black box, and then it comes out, right? We don't get to choose. It's not a fee for a service. It's not like if you look, I'm going to a concert, I got to buy these tickets, but there's a fee. That's something different. There could also be a tax. Then that tax goes on to the government, right? But we're not in a situation where we get to decide where, but it's based on the principle that there's an action at a distance, right? There's this action that, we want to assume that our representatives are acting in our best interest. But we also know that, the mechanism by which we hold them accountable is voting. We can vote them in or out. It's like once every however often you vote, and Americans don't vote as much as we might. We could vote more, but would it be solved through, can we vote in people who will represent our interests? Or are they also dealing with organized interests or factions that are upholding what I've called here, a quasi-religious faith in the mechanisms of capitalism as a productive force? So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Phil.
So you've already kind of talked about this. I think with Steph's question, you talked about how your chief concern is not business interests, but when it feels like any conversation of corporate social responsibility and not maximizing profits immediately turns into concerns over capital play and what if businesses go everywhere else and there's no jobs and the economy collapses. So how would you kind of respond to that idea?
Yeah, capital flight, that threat, right? A threat. Well, where do they go? They go to tax havens. What are tax havens? Tax havens aren't just tax havens. I thought they were. These are places, countries or states in the United States where you don't have to pay taxes on certain kinds of income or wealth, right? But what I learned from reading sociology, some sociological studies of wealth managers, and the logics that they employ, it's not, a lot of times people are hiding their money not just from governments, but from their own creditors or their family. in the case of divorces, that sort of thing. So there are these places. There are these places where you can park money, or you can, and it's a complex system. I mean, I try really hard to understand from my own perspective, meaning like what I can possibly understand without, really truly understanding econometrics, but like, what do these systems do? How do they work? Why do we have them? Who put the pressure on those countries? Where does the money that, if you park your money in a tax haven, does it just stay there? What incentivizes states or countries that are tax havens to do that? Ostensibly because it would benefit their own citizens, or at least that might be the kind of idea that they use. But that's not what happens. Like, we know from the concept of odious debt that I put up here, that if you look at global debt, national debt, the formerly colonized countries have an enormous amount of debt. But I'll give you my favorite, maybe controversial example. I mean, I think this is super controversial, but if you look at the history of Haiti as a country has been in debt ever since they fought a revolution against the French to free themselves from slavery. They were penalized. Nobody wanted the Haitian state to be recognized as legitimate. They didn't have any way to borrow money. And France basically said, well, listen, y'all are now, if you're not going to be slaves, you're going to have to, pay back those property owners that enslaved you before. It doesn't make any sense to me. But that's what happened. So when people talk about Haiti as poor in 2025, without understanding that that's how that happened, anyway, that's sort of how I think about it.
Faculty should feel free. Students too, but faculty definitely should feel free.
Sorry if I'm scaring everyone. Sometimes I get very intense about these questions. Yeah, it's Rob.
So would you say that the existing tax code is malleable enough to withstand reform, or do you think it's something that entirely needs scrapped and rewritten?
Yeah, I do. Okay, the question is, do I think that the tax code could be reformed, or does it need to be entirely scrapped in some sense? My argument is that it needs to be completely revised based on different structural principles or ideas, and more, with different goals in mind. Having said that, do I understand the tax code? Not super well, because it is very complex. Think about taxes, like everybody hates paying taxes. But the better access you have to expertise, economic and accounting expertise, the more you find those loopholes, right? The more you can get around things. It's like a sport. It's like a game, Everybody feels it. I mean, if we're united in one thing, as a country, it's trying to game taxes. I don't know. I mean, if I'm wrong about that, or if that sounds wrong, please tell me, but it feels like that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Kind of on top of that, what are your thoughts on current implementations of sustainability or progressiveness in the tax code, where it's, you get credits if you give to charity, or if you're good environmentally, or things like that? Do you think that that's a step in the right direction, or is that just masking a bigger problem?
Well, okay, so the question is, what do I think about things like tax credits for sustainability, like carbon tax credits or something like that? And is that just masking a problem? Yeah, that is what I think, actually. I think it just masks the problem because because look at it this way. And I guess I'll make something really clear, right? Like what's going to happen when people can't buy food in a few days? What's going to happen? Charity's going to happen. Or mutual aid is going to happen, right? But it's going to be completely dependent on whether individuals choose to do that, or if organizations, and organizations who give charity don't always give it without any further goal. And relatedly, people create charitable trusts to hide money as well. I know you all know that. Not always, but the foundations. Like, look at something like the Gates Foundation, right? Oh, it's so great that they gave all these, computers to schools. Well, did the schools ask for those? No, they didn't. That's just what they got, because that's what they wanted to give. So, to me, it's about authority, it's about power, it's about decision-making. Charities and organizations that decide what people need. I mean, and the state does this too. Our welfare system does this. There's an assumption of what people, what they want or need. It's very, it's not as iterative of a process as it could be, I think. Yes, Ryan.
I just, as I was listening to you talk about kind of the goal of introducing democracy into taxation, it strikes me that at the moment, democratic power in the United States is wielded by Donald Trump. And I guess I don't know how, and I'm curious about how we get, why would you confidence that the democratic process results in the bringing forth of values that are better than what we have now, when at least the last decade suggested to me that might not be true?
Yeah, I mean, that assumes that what we have, Brian, that's a great question. Dr. Sexton, yeah. So I think people could probably hear you. I could try to restate that. But what gives me confidence, how do I restate your question? So basically, isn't what we have democratic?
Well, no. Would, I guess, the kind of democracy you're talking about be better than what we have democratic now?
Well, it would be better for some people. It is going to definitely be worse for other people in the sense that some people, but yeah, it's an aspirational concept of democracy. I might say, we live in a representative system, but we have a kind of democratic veneer. So did the British Empire. That's why they were so confused, trying to they were like, hey, we're a democratic country, that's also a monarchy, right? But we also, so we decided that we know slavery isn't within that, that's not a good form to use. But yet, also had no problem incentivizing, coercing labor, and then still maintaining the veneer of democracy. So how do we guarantee that something is better in the future? It would be, I guess, I do. I look at it kind of idealistically. If we can steer the ship, we're not steering the ship now. That's what I'm saying. There's no, I don't think that this process that we have, and I know that this is a hot take, and I understand that most people don't agree with me about this, but this is my perspective. It doesn't look like it is process or outcome oriented, and it hasn't been, let me be clear, it hasn't been for a long time. It wasn't designed that way. We tell ourselves some stories about, our national founding, but democracy has been a concept that has always been sort of made, Ancient democracy, interestingly enough, in ancient democracy, what made a democracy was the use of the technology of lotteries, not the technology of elections. Election is also a technology. Lotteries to choose decision makers. Lotteries are, as my colleague Peter Stone talks about it, they're irrational. They have no rationality because the rationality that comes out of elections is always a rationality that is based in some kind of, I guess you could say bias, right? And so our lottery, okay, so what if we were to govern using lotteries? It could be worse, it could be better, it's true. It would have to have other kinds of things in place. But again, I'm trying to expand our idea of what a democratic imagination could look like. And I definitely want to be clear that whatever's going on in the United States right now isn't just a result of one presidency. It's a long history and a development of law and development processes. Yeah, thank you. Thought I saw. Oh, yes, Dr. Zemke.
Hi. Do the changes that you talk about require a shift in power from the state and businesses, corporations towards like the citizens and average people? And if so, what kind of power do we citizens really have? Or can you think of any ways in which that shift is taking place?
Thank you, Dr. Zemke. What kind of access do we have? We don't. But we could seize the instruments, the technologies of power. Now, what are those, and you know, when I talk about revolutionary accounting, it's supposed to be a bloodless revolution in some sense, or I think of it that way. It is a taking of power in its technological forms, you know, and right now we don't have a right to it. Those things are owned by private, you know, a lot of things are owned privately or are, you know, or in the state is being dismantled in many ways. I mean, one way to look at sort of the trend over time in who governs in the United States is it's been increasingly people who really are making decisions with the assumption that government should be as small, as little as possible, and almost an elimination of the, you know, that the society is better steered by businesses acting in their own self-interest. I mean, that's what people get from the history of capitalism. They say, you know, like Adam Smith, who wrote in The Wealth of Nations that, you know, the economy will help everyone as if by an invisible hand. But Adam Smith, if you read his work on taxes, which I wrote about, he was for progressive taxation, or at least proportional taxation. And he was against taxing poor people. But you wouldn't know that from the way that his work has filtered down into present understandings. Most people would think, you know, but he was a moral theorist. He really, you know, he's responsible for inventing, in some sense, economics as a scientific discipline. And where I think he got it wrong is that, you know, he thought of production as a science and then distribution as something that humans can control. I'm arguing that production is something that humans can control. It's hard to control it because right now, it's in the control of a small number of people in general. The wealth accumulates at the top. Yes.
I have a question. I'll look this way. I've got a number of questions, actually. So one thesis that you have seems to be that taxation functions as a means of legitimation for the state, right? So, I mean, when you invoke Jürgen Habermas earlier, the state has two functions: economic function, but then also serving the interests of the people. And taxation, as you said, sits between there. So it's a means for the state to legitimate itself with the people. We're allowing this economic activity, but look, we're going to tax it and then distribute it. Don't pay attention, though, too much to the means of production, to the organization of power. Instead, focus on distribution. Right? Okay, so that was one part of your story. Then you told us about South Africa, and I thought this was really interesting. Their taxation functions to create wage laborers, so to create a certain kind of citizen. So my question is whether taxation functions that way in our system. And I'm not seeing that immediately. So how does taxation function to create a particular kind of citizen in a democratic system? And I think you could answer that, but you didn't really speak to that question.
Yeah.
Did everybody hear me? Is that clear enough?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, the way I look at it is that, well, it's not true that everybody in this country has to work for someone else to make money, but it is true if you don't already have money. So, if you, and I'm very aware of this because of my own life path, right? Like, you kind of have to earn money, right? Unless you're born with money. How do businesses start? This was always something that was very confusing to me as a child. How do you get that kind of money to start a business, right? Well, we know that it's through financing. Actually, in debt financing in general, many people actually know now that debt financing that was introduced by Alexander Hamilton because of the Hamilton the musical. It's meant, or at least I paid attention to that part of it. But because in the United States, like, let's start. I will get to your question, I hope. But in the United States, our sort of founding revolutionary myth or founding revolutionary narrative is no taxation without representation. So guess what wasn't very popular in the beginning? Taxes. So how do you fund a government? Okay, Hamilton said debt financing. We'll borrow it. We'll borrow it from people who have it, right? So in that sense, the nation was sort of founded on the idea that, government would borrow money from people who, right now it's just super complicated, right? The government sells bonds. Those are, that's a way it kind of borrows from the people. You're supposed to get a return on the investment. I forgot your question. What was the part? So is it, can you reasonably?
I'll restate it.
Yeah, wage
I'll
work.
restate it. So in South Africa, I own a bunch of huts.
Mm-hmm.
The government taxes my huts. That makes me enter the workforce. I become a wage laborer.
Yes.
So taxation functioned there to create a particular kind of person. Does it function like that in our country now? And because that's not immediately obvious to me. So how does taxation create a particular kind of citizen or subject in our context? Because we're not taxing huts.
No.
We're taxing income, we're taxing consumption. So how does that create a particular kind of citizen?
It's the same process. It's the same process. How did it work? I guess I didn't explain this. How did taxation function to create wage laborers where they weren't there? It was very simple. It was like, you owe us, this government, this colonial government, this tax, which is the British pound. How do you get a British pound? You have to go work for somebody who has them.
Right, but here, I don't owe tax unless I'm already a wage laborer. Now,
can you survive without a wage?
Right. That's a different question, though.
No, that's
I'm asking how does our taxation system create a particular kind of subject? I think it could still, but it seems like it has to be a different story nowadays from the story that you told in South Africa. Does that make sense?
Well, no, I do. I understand. And this is what I've been struggling with this research all along, is trying to explain why this is such an important example. Or whether it reflects something that's true. The way I see it, you more or less, you can kind of go off the grid, right, in the United States, or can you? Can you go live in a tent and not pay taxes, not buy food? People try to do this all the time, live sort of off the grid, but to a certain extent that they can. And that's what a lot of people resist about our economic system. Now, is it the tax system that's doing that? Not only, because wage labor is already the assumption here, but wage labor is the assumption. And maybe not wage labor, maybe wage work, right? Because or even, it's not even just wages, it's salaries too. When you work for someone else, I guess this is an observation that's probably controversial, but if you work for an organization you are required to work on behalf of their goals. That's what you're there to do. The reason that you get the money is, because you're there for a certain amount of time or you produce a certain number of things. It's a certain form of work. There are other forms of work. I mean, when we think about how creative people, how creativity happens from a psychological standpoint, it's often, psychologists have described this thing called flow, where you just forget, you forget you're even working. Have you ever written a paper where you were like, oh, I hate this is terrible. And then all of a sudden you're almost done and you didn't even realize what happened. Or, because time passes differently when you are doing something of your own free will than of a kind of force. And by force, I mean that you have to. And my experience in this country is that I didn't have a choice whether to work or not. And I think that's the experience of most people. Now, most people don't think that you should have a choice to work or not work. I think. I don't know. So it gets very confusing. So maybe it's not taxation that does that. It's the whole it's commodity production in general. What is a commodity? A commodity is something that you can buy and sell. It's not a commodity unless it's bought or sold. Can we produce things that aren't commodities? Yes. But once you sell art, it becomes a commodity. It gets exchanged. And the term here that, obviously I get from Karl Marx is alienation. What happens to a society that is organized that way is that instead of, we sort of exist through commodities. Commodities have relationships to each other, and our relationships to each other are mediated by commodities. It doesn't answer your question. You're right.
Mindy,
Yes.
business owners treated differently under the tax scheme than people who are working for other people? And isn't there a certain amount of trust or lack of auditing or something for business owners, like in terms of reporting taxes?
I don't know exactly how to answer that. So the idea is, isn't there a certain amount of trust for business owners in terms of reporting, self-reported or whatever? I mean, I think the general, if you look at it, the way I sort of look at it is at a micro level, our society rests on the assumption that we protect profit-making businesses because whatever they do, we protect them through our legal codes, with our security, with our military. How much of military operations overseas, what are we doing overseas? A lot of times we are protecting trade routes. I don't know, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong about this. That's what we're doing, we're protecting business interests. The assumption, which is not enacted into law, is that somehow benefits everybody. It's in the name of everybody or something like that. It's in our name, it's our legal code. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, how come? It's really hard to research businesses from my perspective. I think that, meaning to understand, businesses would have to report certain things to the government for tax purposes. But then we also have these quasi-governmental organizations like the Security and Exchange Commission that are supposed to regulate the environment that they operate in. So I guess what I would say is that we give a lot of trust to for-profit businesses. But the logic of how for-profit businesses work probably doesn't deserve that.
One last question, and then we'll call it an evening. Do you have anything else from students, for example? I'm sure we have one more question.
All right, Tamba. No?
If there is a student,
It's you, Tamba. It's all you.
Okay. So, is there a list from what I understand from your goal, which is very idealistic? Is there something realistic that can be achieved at the end, since we all know that most of us are not stewards of both the capitalistic system or the accounting you want to connect it to ethics. Maybe ethics is the wrong place, the wrong thing to connect to the system itself. Maybe we should simply think about it as a legal system and then rely on its coercion. And maybe that can help us. Is there, what do you think about that?
I think that you are right, and I am a political theorist who studies power. I'm not making a moral argument. I'm not. I'm making an argument about democratic power. This isn't, and frankly, you know, like I've been so nervous about this because I'm speaking words that I know are controversial, and I'm really grateful for you all for listening and for discussing this with me. But one way I do look at it is that it's you know, there's no like sort of single subjectivity or approach. You know, people don't experience the economy all as a homo economicus. Rather, we experience things from our perspective. And so class analysis helps me to do that. Classes, you know, there's a class or a group, an organized group of people. I mean, increasingly, the United States has been, like, scholars are calling it an oligarchy. That means it's been captured by a class of people who own most everything. Now, but the rest of us, we are a majority. We are more people. But yet we identify with the structures, right? We are convinced by their legitimacy claims. They are convinced by their own legitimacy claims to a certain extent. All of us, if it's a structural problem, I like to point this out. This is true of things like racism and sexism. If it's a structural problem, that means that every individual that is affected by that isn't completely in control of it. If we live in a system, like when people make the claim that a system is racist, or a system supports racism, then within that system, it's supporting individuals making decisions, the outcome of which might be racist. It's not an individual racist or something like that. That's how I look at it from an economic standpoint. One of the things about it being a structural problem is that it's action at a distance. Like we don't have responsibility for it or something like that. I lost my train of thought. Did that answer it, Dr. Nwandu? A little bit. But no, you're right. It's really, I mean, I'm honored to be asked to do an ethics, but I'm not an ethicist.
Ethics at John Carroll, broadly construed.
I believe that I am attempting to, I do think there's an ethical, I have some sort of ethical or moral attachment to the notion of democracy, or the notion of majority rule, or, you know, away from, I mean, you know, I'm a conditioned American. We overthrew a king. Well, we didn't overthrow the king. We did not overthrow the king. French overthrew their king. We just said we're going to kindly create our own society here because you're not representing us. I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Please thank Dr.
Thank you so much.